Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for a State Historians Council Roundtable, Lifting the Hood, Denver's KKK Ledgers. My name is Dawn DePrince, and I am the Chief Operating Officer for History Colorado. Before we start this evening, in the spirit of healing and education, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribes with historic ties to the state of Colorado. These tribes are our partners. We consult with them when we plan exhibits, collect, preserve, and interpret artifacts, do archaeological work, and create educational programs. We recognize these Indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants of this land. The conversation we will have tonight is the result of many months of planning and preparation. The staff at History Colorado has come together to share Denver's KKK ledgers as freely and widely as possible, but also to share them carefully and take responsibility for framing them in constructive and appropriate ways. Consulting with 12 community partners has been essential to this process. Please visit our webpage for the ledgers to see all of their names and affiliations. I know that many of them are in our audience tonight, and I hope they know my sincere gratitude for their contributions. Their input led to the guiding principle behind our work on this project, which is to frame the materials we are about to discuss in a context of resistance to oppression and emphasize the voices and perspectives of those targeted and silenced by 20th century organized white supremacy in Colorado, namely people identified by Klan members as atheist, Black, Catholic, communist, LGBTQ, immigrant, Jewish, and Muslim. We know that engagement around these materials is a process that our community gives to each other and to History Colorado, and we are deeply grateful for your participation with us tonight. In a postmodern culture seemingly eager to embrace alternative facts and post-truth paradigms, history organizations like ours have an obligation to practice evidence-based truth-seeking and storytelling that illuminates a plurality of perspectives, experiences, and events. This is the spirit of tonight's event, and it is also the fabric of who History Colorado is and the work that we do throughout our state. If you share our belief that historical context is more vital to public dialogue than ever before, please consider a gift today through our website or become a member of History Colorado if you have not already joined us. Your support in these challenging times is sincerely appreciated. As tonight's discussion will surely illustrate, understanding the many chapters of Denver's history is critical to building a better future for all people in our state and capital city. Please join us this summer for Building Denver, a full slate of exhibitions, public programs, and partnerships that create opportunities for personal reflection and community dialogue, empowering us to collectively envision a healthier, more inclusive, and more equitable home. You can learn more at historycolorado.org. And now, I am delighted to turn this over to my colleague, Jason Hansen, who is History Colorado's Chief Creative Officer. He will introduce us to Colorado's incredible State Historians Council and facilitate their illuminating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dawn, and thank you to everyone out there for being here tonight. Welcome. As Dawn said, I am the Chief Creative Officer at History Colorado. What that means is I am one of the luckiest people alive. I have one of really a dream job. And one of the reasons that's true is I am incredibly lucky to do such meaningful work with such inspiring people. I wanted to begin tonight by just giving us a little context on how we got to this moment with these ledgers, to discuss them and to view them online from the comfort of our own homes. These are when we talk about the KKK membership ledgers, these are records of membership kept by Denver's Klu Klux Klan in the 1920s at the height of their power in the state. They are 1,300 pages, more than 1,300 pages, and they have more than 30,000 entries in them. They record members' names, whether they paid their dues, their home addresses, and where they worked. They are the sort of bureaucratic records that any organization might keep. If you saw the slideshow at the beginning, you saw some images of them, and you can always check them out on our website. How did they come to History Colorado? We received them in 1946 from an editor at the Rocky Mountain News. The curator who received them, a man named Leroy Hafen, who was also the state historian at the time, agreed to seal them from the public until 1990. And so they sat in History Colorado's archive. In the 1970s, researchers were given access to the records and started to publish work based on what they found in them. And they were made available to the public through our research center in 1990. That means that anyone who came to the research center was able to view them. But last year, through a grant from the Colorado Historic Records Advisory Board, History Colorado was able to undertake digitizing them. And last week, after consulting with a number of community groups, we released them online for anyone here to search. We didn't just release them online, we've prepared quite a lot of context to help us all understand what the Klan was like in the 20s and how it may reverberate today. We have articles, we have quite a bit of information. We have programming, beginning with tonight's program. Colorado is incredibly lucky to have our own State Historians Council. The council reaches across the state and aids in our interpretation of the history of Colorado in the West. And they help us expand our understanding of the historical perspectives, cultures, and places of Colorado, producing and sharing new scholarship about our state and helping us all make sense of how we got to now. And I would like to introduce them to you now. Go ahead and turn on your camera when I introduce you, please. First, we have Dr. Nikki Gonzalez. Nikki is a professor of history at Regis University whose research includes the American Southwest and the Chicano movement in Colorado. We have Dr. Tom Noel. Tom, known to many of us as Dr. Colorado, is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Colorado, Denver. He has written more than 50 books and countless articles about Colorado and the West. Dr. Jared Dorsey. Jared is a professor of history at Colorado State University and the director of the Public Lands History Center. His work specializes in environmental and borderlands history, and his book on explorer Zebulon Pike was a finalist for the Colorado Book Awards recently. Dr. William Way is a professor of history at the University of Colorado Boulder, where his research focuses on modern China and Asian American history. He is also the editor-in-chief of the online Colorado Encyclopedia, so he literally brings an encyclopedic knowledge of Colorado to his role on the council. And his forthcoming book will focus on History Colorado's Zoom-In exhibition, spotlighting 100 objects that define our history as the Centennial State. And then finally, Dr. Dwayne Vandenbush. Hi, Dwayne. Dwayne is a professor of history at Western Colorado University, where he has taught the history of the US West, especially water, public lands, and the environment, since 1962. And his book on the Western Slope has been the standard text on the region since it was published in 1981. He is the chair of the council this year and the Colorado State Historian for the 2020-2021 term. We are very lucky to have such learned and distinguished scholars here tonight. We are going to get into the conversation now, a little bit about how tonight will go. This is a conversation. It is something that we are all lucky to get to observe rather than a conference presentation or a series of papers that everyone is sharing tonight. I imagine the conversation will touch on much of what you and I want to ask our State Historians Council. But if you do have a question, please feel free to share it through the chat feature. My History Colorado colleagues and I will be monitoring it, and I will do my best to find opportune moments to share them with our council members. With that, I'd like to start the conversation by asking our council members to address what might be the biggest question for many of us, and that is, there was a significant presence of the Klu Klux Klan in Colorado in the 1920s. Is this the same Klu Klux Klan that came out of the Reconstruction South after the Civil War? And how prominent was it, really? Please, historians, give us some historical context.
So Jason, I'd love to jump in. Before I get too far along, can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Jared.
Yes.
Okay. Terrific. Okay. So to answer your question briefly, no, it's not the same Klan that emerged out of the South after the Civil War. As a child, as I was growing up, I remember hearing stories about from my family about how my family had hidden in their home when the Klan marched down their street in their small Indiana town in the 1920s. And that story always puzzled me. My family was white and they lived in the North. So why would they have had occasion to fear the Klan or even encounter it at all? And it wasn't until I got to grad school that I began to understand the origins of my confusion. So the Klan that frightened my forebears was in fact a totally different entity than the one that had haunted the children's civil rights literature that I had avidly consumed as a youngster. And here's the point that I want to make tonight for us is the Klan is not an organization. It's not a thing with a centralized authority and an enduring set of beliefs and activities, universal objectives. Rather, it's more of an episodic phenomenon. It's a periodic welling up of deep and dark waters in the American soul. And in that darkness lurks a very narrow and excluding definition of who is an American, and a suspicion and fear, even a hatred of anyone or anything that seems to lie beyond that definition. And so it pops up now and then throughout history, here and there. And the Klan is an expression of that darkness, but there have been many clans. So the first Klan is the one that you referred to. It emerged after the Civil War in Tennessee, and it quickly spread throughout the South. Its primary aims were political, basically to wrest control of Southern governments by terrorizing Black voters and their white Republican allies. It was an exclusively Southern organization. And here's the interesting thing. It went defunct in the 1870s. It ceased to exist entirely. Now, the second Klan emerged in the 1910s, and it was a nationwide phenomenon, and Colorado was a particular hotbed. And it was based on bad history. So around the turn of the century, a group of Southern apologist historians, that's people like us here on this council. So we have to take some acknowledgement for our responsibility for our profession for the rise of the second Klan. A group of Southern apologist historians began to reinterpret the Klan as a heroic protector of the South against lawless, immoral Yankee rule. And their scholarship leaked into mainstream culture and inspired, among other things, the production of a film called Birth of a Nation, whose plot centered on Klansmen preserving the virtue of white women. President Woodrow Wilson showed it at the White House, and he remarked, and remember that he's not just a politician, but he's a scholar. He's a political scientist and a historian, former president of Princeton University. And after seeing the film, he said it was like writing history with lightning. It was so terribly true. Of course, it wasn't true, but this invented memory of Klansmen as hooded superheroes took hold and inspired this guy, Colonel William Collins, to found a second Klan. Now, this time around, the Klan had a broader objective than just preventing the Black vote in the South. Its objectives varied by locale, but they were united by an obsession over the purity of white Americanness and morality. And their targets in Colorado and elsewhere were not only Blacks, but Jews, immigrants, Catholics, socialists, anti-prohibitionists, and pretty much anyone who failed to meet the Klan's ideal blend of white Protestants' upstanding Americanness. And it's this narrow view that led them to march against my French Catholic immigrant forebears in Indiana. And it's also what enabled them to put down the deep roots and troubling roots in Colorado. The specifics of which you'll hear from my colleagues more about in just a moment. I just want to round out here by mentioning that as we saw, the second Klan and other hate groups thrive when history is widely misunderstood or even deliberately manipulated or distorted. And so that's why the preservation of accurate primary original documents like the History Colorado's Klan membership rolls is so important. And to guard against the spread of falsehood, it's also essential that they be made publicly accessible, which I know y'all are doing. And that's also what makes me so glad to be part of tonight's conversation. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues to talk more specifically about the Klan in Colorado.
Well, if I can,
Is there anyone who'd like to build on that? Tom?
unless someone else wants to.
No, please.
Are we all set, Jason?
Go ahead, Tom.
I'm unmuted and my video is started. The question that I think a lot of us ask, why would anybody join the Klan? What was the reason for this? And here are these ledger books and also a wonderful kind of definitive history by Robert Allen Goldberg called The Invisible Empire in Colorado. Tell us why people want to join. It was not primarily racial or ethnic hatred that led them in. Many people joined because they thought this was the way to restore law and order. This is the 1920s. With prohibition, with corruption in both political parties, the Klan jumps in and says, we're going to give you the truth. We're going to tell you, we're going to protect the legal system here. There was also pressure from churches. Maybe you've heard of the Pillar of Fire Church, which actually had its headquarters in Westminster and what's still that tower you see on the turnpike, I'm dating myself, on 36 going up to Boulder. They had a radio station, which I think existed fairly recently, and were adamantly anti-Catholic. Their Bishop Alma White constantly denouncing the Catholic Church. Also, there was pressure from jobs. If you wanted to keep your job, your employer was a devout Kluxer, he would fire you or he would sign you up. Many people who weren't particularly interested were signed up by their churches. Klansmen would come into churches regularly and interrupt a service with the permission of the preacher there and recruit Klan members. Also, many of the Klan meetings were actually in churches. And Jared, if I get any of this wrong, I'm counting on you to straighten it out. The fraternal orders, the Masons in particular, they were very adamantly pro-Klan and pushed their members to join the Klan. The discrimination was aimed not, as Jared was saying, not so much at Blacks as it was at Jews and Catholics. The Catholics were probably the largest group available. There weren't that many Blacks here to worry about at that time. Others joined this, as the case of Canyon City particularly, because they saw this as a progressive reform group. They were actually pushing education, libraries, parks, a lot of good things. So many well-intentioned people joined this, and racism was just a small part of the broader agenda. Onward.
Thank you, Tom. So what I'm hearing you say is it's not quite as simple as we might think, the reasons why people join the Klan, which I think is important to keep in mind as our conversation goes on. I do want to remind a few people
the
were
prevailing stereotype, Jason, of being racist and race-centered is not accurate. And with the help of things like this ledger book, we're going to be able to rewrite some history once again.
terrific. Thank you, Tom. I want to remind all our panelists, please speak up loudly so that your microphone picks you up clearly. I know some of our audience members may be having a little bit of trouble hearing. And with that, Nikki, did you want to build on what Tom was saying?
Sure, I'll just give a little bit more context to what Tom and Jared have already said. So yeah, I think, Tom, I think you're right that, race wasn't front and center, but certainly discrimination was, and we can't downplay that. And just to talk a little bit about the appeal of law and order and why that was a big deal at this time. If we look like contextually at what's happening in America at this time and in Colorado specifically, we are coming out of a progressive era, which brought a lot of reforms and changed society in really important ways. But I think one of the major kind of drivers of change in society that caused a lot of people to feel really uneasy is large-scale immigration. And between 1880 and like 1920, we have about 23.5 million immigrants coming into the country because of the heavy industries like steel and mining and railroads and smelting and agriculture, which, we here in Colorado, we had all of those. And so these immigrants are coming from like Southern and Eastern Europe, predominantly Southern and Eastern Europe. So countries like Italy, Romania, Russia, and Eastern European countries like Hungary and the Slavic countries and so forth. And so most of these immigrants are Catholic or Jewish. And so for white Protestants in the United States, that was really unsettling. And there became all of these kind of conspiracy theories that the Pope was going to take over America and that these Jewish immigrants were going to bring their radical politics into America and start, contribute to the labor movement here, which, people feared. And so the appeal of the Klan, they did harbor these prejudices and people were really kind of hungry for that law and order that was promised by the Klan. So yeah, I just wanted to provide that context.
Thanks, Nikki. Dwayne, I think you were starting to speak. Yeah, unmute yourself. There you go.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I'll comment on what happened out in western Colorado, Grand Junction, Montrose, Gunnison, that area, Durango. The Klu Klux Klan, as some of my colleagues have mentioned, was not a Southern organization. There were more members in Indiana and California than any other Southern state. And one of the great writers and critics, H.L. Mencken, made the comment one time that the Klan gave people an opportunity to dress up in a white hood and a white dress and engage in hocus pocus. And they certainly resembled what I like to call the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And we had a great example of that in where I live in the Gunnison country. As Nikki mentioned, a lot of the people who came in as immigrants came in from Southeastern Europe, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they came to a town called Crested Butte to work in the coal mines. And the number 3 coal mine in Colorado was the CF&I Big Mine in Crested Butte. And all of the people who came in obviously did not speak English, came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they came from Slovakia, Slovenia, Italy, Austria, Serbia, and they were all Catholic. And they were looked down upon by the people who lived in Gunnison, which were primarily Anglo and ranchers. And that formed a division that still exists today. And the Klan burned crosses on Chocolate Peak, which is just on the west edge of Crested Butte, and reached their peak in the 1920s. In Gunnison, one of the people I interviewed named Ryle Lake, whose father ran the newspaper, talked about the Klan hiring the Western State College band and marching all the way to the college and then burning a cross on Tupelo Hill right above the college. So the Klan was a tremendous organization, and you couldn't have, in power, and you couldn't have been elected a drain commissioner on the Western Slope unless you were a member of the Klan or were supported by the Klan. And I'm going to give you a good example of a couple of things that happened. The Western State College president in the 1920s was a man named Sam Quigley, and he was forced to resign because of the Ku Klux Klan. One of the members on the faculty was a man named John C. Johnson, who was Catholic. He was forced to resign and went on to start the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory 35 miles to the north in Gothic, which has produced some of the great studies on climate change and high altitude research. And then I'm going to read you a little letter that I got from a lady named Fisher, whose father, Pat Grattan, was an outstanding athlete at Western State in the 1920s, student body president, captain of the football team, captain of the basketball team, one of the top boxers. And I'm going to read part of a letter that she wrote to me. And she said this: "These were dark moments for Pat, who experienced a dark chapter in our nation's history. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan began to grow in power in Colorado, and the main target of these bigots, with few blacks in the state, were Catholics and Jews. In Colorado, the Klan influenced and became prominent in the legislature, school and town boards, many police departments, and they began to hunt for Catholics. They found a couple at Western State, and one of them was Pat Grattan, who lost his job and was forced to leave. And fortunately, towards the end of the 1920s, courageous newspaper editors and the law, which nailed some of the Klan members on income tax evasion, began to lessen the power of the Klan. But it was very big out here in Western Colorado and places like Grand Junction, Durango, Montrose, and Gunnison. And primarily because of immigrants and Catholics, because there were very few Jewish people or blacks on the Western Slope at that time.
Thanks, Dwayne. William, did you want to add something?
Yes, I'd be delighted to add some comments to this evening's discussion. What I'd like to do is broaden the discussion, both in terms of geography and time, as some folks have already done. What I want to do is to talk about the pernicious problem of white supremacy and its promotion of racial violence. Now look, while the KKK with their hoods, robes, and burning crosses may be the symbol of American white supremacy and terrorism, there are other groups who share their sentiments and values, right? Indeed, as some folks have observed, what was said at KKK rallies is almost word for word what is being said today by the alt-right, such as, well, put America first, which means really put white Americans first to the exclusion and the detriment of people of color. Yeah. What I'm trying to say is that the alt-right are using the same playbook because they have the same, well, hate-filled agenda. They continue to use the same extra legal means, violence, advocated by the KKK since its inception and in its various reincarnations. These hate groups have created a toxic atmosphere that has poisoned, if you will, politics. There's really no need to wonder where the KKK in Colorado has gone, it has mutated into some other hate groups. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there were 22 hate groups in 2019 in Colorado and 17 in 2020. And the fact of the matter, as long as people are into hate, they will find a hate group to belong to. So I wanted to, broaden the context.
I think that's a great point, William. Thank you so much. We've had a number of questions come in from you all out there. Thank you so much. And I am collecting them, and we'll try to share as many as I can. One that has come in, this is coming from Sue, and I think it piggybacks on what you were saying, William. What are some of the ripple effects, do you think, of Colorado having such a large Klan presence in the 1920s, rippling forward through the ensuing century?
Oh, yeah.
The things that we might point to.
Yes. Well, for obvious reasons, I'd like to point out that most recently, the toxic atmosphere that I've referred to has resulted in a spate of anti-Asian crimes, hate crimes, anti-Asian hate crimes. And these hate crimes have been around, of course, for a long time. The only reason why they were not necessarily visited upon Asians in the state and in some parts of the interior West is because they had already driven them out. Yeah, they already driven them out. But clearly, the KKK, as Dwayne has pointed out, were much present in the West, in California, in Washington State, and in Texas. So they have, if you will, engaged in terrorism against Asian Americans in these various places where they exist. And they do so for the same reasons that have already been mentioned. They were foreign, right? We're talking about a nativist phenomenon. They were foreign, they were immigrant. They may not have been Catholic, they may not have been Jewish. They were worse. They were heathens. Yeah, they didn't share, any of the established religions, which made them even, more problematic. And these days, certainly in conjunction with the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen an extraordinary increase in hate crimes against Asians. Asian hate crimes have increased 149% from 2019 to 2020, after the outbreak of the coronavirus. Yep. One of the groups that keeps tracks of these things, the Stop Anti-Asian Hate group, has recorded about 4,000 anti-Asian hate incidents from March 2020 to February 2021. And 11% of these incidents involved physical violence. So, these hate groups have found, in effect, another group to victimize. Pointed out, it wasn't simply Blacks, and it was also, Jews, Catholics, but more broadly, it was anti-immigrant and anti-people of color. So I think it has repercussions across the nation and across time.
As William's updating the story of racism, which unfortunately is still with us, reminds me there's not only a first and a second Klan, but a third Klan in the 1970s that became active. Every time permits were pulled for the Martin Luther King parade here in Denver, the KKK would also apply for a permit to perform that same day and disrupt the parade. This third Klan was opposed, of course, to integrating schools to Dr. King, to all of the civil rights movement. And unfortunately, they're still with us. seemed to wax and wane, but it was undergone. Another point I thought I'd make is that also the KKK was very much interested in government. John Galen Locke was not particularly a racist himself. He had a secretary who was Catholic. He paid the pew rents for 2 Catholic housekeepers of his. His main interest seemed to be political and controlling a political scenario, which he did, of course, with electing Ben Stapleton as mayor, Rice Means as U.S. Senator in the 20s, when it was probably the most powerful Klan we've ever seen, when even President Woodrow Wilson, excuse me, not Woodrow Wilson, but his President Harding, his successor, actually joined the Klan in a ceremony at the White House.
Speaking of John Galen Locke, we have some questions about how the Klan was ultimately taken down in Colorado. You mentioned tax evasion. Did journalists play a role? Can you fill us in a little bit more on how they were taken down? Who did it?
Yeah, I can comment on that. I was the one who mentioned it, Jason. What happened was that courageous newspaper editors began to expose some of the activities of the Klan. A lot of them were afraid to do it, but some of these individuals did. And when they found out some of the illegal activities going on with the Klan that they made a lot of money off of, such as selling illegal liquor, such as getting involved in all kinds of criminal episodes, the Internal Revenue Service wanted to find out why the Ku Klux Klan wasn't paying taxes on some of the income that they had coming in or some of the land that they got. And the Klan found it pretty hard to say, well, we got it by murder or we got it by illegal activities. So they got a lot of the members of the Klan the same way they got Al Capone of Murder Incorporated on income tax evasion and sent him to prison.
By the way, I'd like to underscore the role of journalists in our society. We often think of them as, well, in many respects, another branch of government, the one that keeps the rest of the government, if you will, honest. And the reason why I want to do that is, geez, in the last few years, our journalists have really taken a severe beating for performing their job, So I basically want to, tip my hat to the professional journalists who continue to perform their job under these very difficult circumstances.
And one of the problems that we have today is a lot of newspapers are going out of business, and we're getting information from different sources. And I'd like to mention Marshall Mcluhan, who wrote a book in the 1960s called Understanding Media, in which his main point was the news is not the most important thing. It's how we get the news. The media is the message.
Yeah.
So today we get this from cell phones and social media and Facebook, and that's a far cry from what we got from independent journalism of before.
Yeah.
And I think it's played a major role on some of the difficulties that we have today.
I would agree with the role of journalists. I think they were critical. And I would also add to that the role of just activists, right? People who were resisting the Klan in whatever way they could. There are 2 very prominent African Americans, both doctors, one a dentist and one a physician. I had this written down, Dr. Joseph Henry Peter Westbrook, who actually infiltrated the Klan. He was a light-skinned African-American, infiltrated the Klan, kind of did reconnaissance and brought back information to the 5 Points neighborhood, warning them of impending marches or cross burnings and so forth. And then Dr. Clarence Holmes, who helped found the Denver Interracial Committee, and they're both active at the NAACP. And so always putting pressure on the Klan in their policies or politics. And then there's also the Catholic Church also put a fair amount of pressure on the Klan as well. There was a father, Matthew Smith, who was editor of the publication of the Archdiocese at the time, which was called the Denver Catholic Register. And he published article after article that tried to expose the Klan for what they were, try to uncover their dirty deeds behind the scenes and so forth. And also propping up the Catholic population in Denver, saying, stay the course, don't give in to this violence, this rhetoric and so forth, but, just stay the course. And so that was good. And then I have to share this little story from Regis, because I teach at Regis University. In, I think it was 1922 or 1923, there was word that the Klan was marching from Table Mountain to the Regis, what was then Regis College campus, and they were going to burn a cross on the quad. And the students and the Jesuit priests got word of this, and so they formed a perimeter around around the college, and they were armed with baseball bats. There was some rumors that there were some guns, that some of the Jesuits had guns with them. And when the Klan got word that that there was resistance on the Regis campus, they turned back. And so, you have episode after episode of people resisting the power of the Klan in various ways. And I think after a while, they just wear it down. So, yeah.
Another role of the Klan was as moral reformers. They saw this sinful 1920s era and thought, we've got to go back to good old-fashioned Protestant values. They denounced things like suggestive dancing, titillating moving pictures, joyriding, neckers and petters. And of course, they were after, as Nikki is saying, the Catholics. They even tried to run down Monsignor Matthew Smith, and had women approach him and say, come up to my room, where he would be caught. They also had, the Klan brought in a fake nun who would give talks on the corruption in the church and what went on in convents, what really went on in priests. And that could any Catholic man be sure that the priest wasn't the father of his child. So this moral reform was a big part, I think, of the Klan appeal.
Hey, Tom, I got a question for you. Given the problem that the Catholic Church is currently experiencing, and I don't need to detail the problems to you. I'm wondering whether the KKK today is exploiting that.
Nikki, do you know the answer to that?
I don't. I don't really know.
I don't think there's so much after Catholics anymore who mainstream as they once were.
You're right. I've forgotten. Catholics are no longer targets of the nativists.
Yeah, sad to say, there are probably some Catholics that would join the Klan today.
Oh, yes. You get a lot of folks who are trying to, as it were, assimilate into the mainstream society by adopting, if you will, the prejudices of the mainstream society.
So I want to stay with this discussion of resistance a little bit longer. We've had some folks in the chat point out the legal system also played a role in resistance, particularly, maybe most notably, Philip Van Cise, district attorney in Denver, really taking on the Klan. I'm wondering, though, are there places, we've talked a little bit about where the Klan took hold. Are there places where it didn't take hold? And are there any lessons we can draw from that?
In Denver, they did take hold in the country club district and the wealthiest neighborhoods. And I think that was true state and probably nationwide, that the wealthiest folks were not typically joining. Senator Phipps, for instance, never joined the Klan, although he worked with them to get their support in that election in the 20s.
Jason, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. So let me jump in here because I saw the question of Colorado Springs raised in the chat a little while ago, and I think that speaks to the question you just asked. And I want to credit my colleague Adam Thomas here at Colorado State University, and also History Colorado's Sam Bach for pointing this out to me. The Klan did not take root nearly as deeply in Colorado Springs as it did in other places. Adam's dissertation is a comparison of Pueblo and Colorado Springs in a variety of different aspects. And what's interesting that he finds, and Sam mentions this as well, it's interesting that in many ways, the Klan in Colorado in the 1920s was an organization that was designed to exploit divisions in the populace in order to gain political and economic power. In places like Pueblo, it was a credible argument to make racist arguments about the threats of the Hispanic community. As you know, that was a claim that white folks in Pueblo could understand and respond to. In Colorado Springs, however, which was much more racially homogeneous, religiously homogeneous, it wasn't a credible claim to talk about how Catholics or Latinos and Hispanos were a threat to society. So the Klan actually had a lot less success there than it did in appealing to white folks in places like Pueblo. It underscores I think the racial divisiveness that the Klan was appealing to. And it also demonstrates its comparative weakness in areas that were more racially homogeneous. So this also speaks to some of the questions that have been raised in the chat about whether, to what degree Klan action in Colorado was racially motivated. And I think we have to say that that's a pretty strong component of race is a pretty strong component of what was going on.
One of the things we talk about is that when the Klan got rolling after Birth of a Nation in 1915 and then really got big in the 1920s, a lot of people wanted to go back to the good old days. They wanted this was kind of a last stand. In 1925, they had the Scopes trial in Tennessee that pretty much ridiculed fundamentalism, as John Scopes tried to teach evolution in violation of a Tennessee state law. The 1920s very much against immigration, which had increased and increased, very much against women's liberation. They were afraid of the flapper. They were very afraid of illegal booze. And they kind of wanted to go back to the good old days. And, you know, we talked about the Catholics. We have Joe Biden as president today. He is a Catholic, and it's very interesting that he is only the second Catholic president in American history. John F. Kennedy was one, Joe Biden is two. And when Al Smith ran in 1928 for the Democrats, he was victimized by some of the worst vitriol that you ever saw, which involved the Holland Tunnel being extended underneath the Atlantic Ocean to the Vatican, the Pope on his way immediately, and if any Protestant children were born, they would immediately be called bastards. So we've had a Black president, a president of color. We've had a woman vice president, woman of color. We've had a couple of women one woman ran for president, but keep in mind that Catholics weren't much better off than some of the people I've just mentioned. We've only had two, and only a couple have run.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dwayne. And still, even with Biden, it was a big deal, right? People commenting on his Catholic faith still. Yep. So yeah, that's a good point.
Thanks, everyone. I would like to talk a little bit about the ledgers themselves. We're getting a lot of questions about the ledgers themselves. I think a lot of people are apparently looking at them right now. And I do want to say to everybody here, that one of the things that we hope as History Colorado, we don't have all the answers about these ledgers. And so we are hoping that by releasing these more publicly, there are researchers and scholars and others out there who will help us understand some of the symbols that you see stamped on pages. That will help us understand some of the individual stories so that we start to get a better sense of who these people were. I know a number of you have noticed that a lot of folks were rejected. We've been looking up some of those folks and trying to understand why they would be rejected, and some of the causes that we've uncovered are opposition to Prohibition. The Klan was big supporters of Prohibition, as several people have mentioned, and opposition to that seemed to be grounds for removal in some cases. Infidelity, inconsistencies, and the usual sort of tattling on people you don't like. But there don't seem to be hard and fast rules that we are aware of. We would, however, love it as researchers delve into these if they can help us understand some of that. But I want to ask our council members here, as we release these digitally, it's a whole new tool. They have been available publicly since the 90s. They have been on display for the last several decades at History Colorado and our exhibitions, but now they are available worldwide to everybody. What are some of the things that maybe you are looking forward to learning now that they're digitized? What are some of the hopes that you have for the ways that people use this? And what are some of the concerns that maybe you have for the ways that people use this?
And just skimming them lightly, Jason, one of the things is what parts, what neighborhoods, what areas voted this way or joined the Klan or did not. And it seems to me that working class neighborhoods, Northwest Denver, near in South Denver, tended to have higher membership rates there. And that is attributed, some of us think, to the fact that they were living in neighborhoods where there were Catholics and Jews and immigrants, whereas people living in more affluent East and South Denver tended not to be in the membership. But that's just kind of superficial observances from skimming the scrapbooks, the notebooks.
Yeah, I think Tom is onto something. I think a close analysis of the ledger might very well reveal, if you will, the class character of Klan members. And that would be certainly worth knowing.
So I can imagine a really amazing digital tool being developed here to build on what William and Tom just noted. We'll have the capability to put addresses of residents and occupations and things like that onto a map, and then overlay that with other demographic data such as ethnic neighborhoods, immigrant status in neighborhoods, wealth, those kinds of things. And we could create an interactive map that would let us put all of these things together and view them through different, layers using GIS. That could answer all kinds of questions, some of the ones that Tom and William mentioned, but it also would be interesting to try and take a map like that and try and imagine what it was, where you have perhaps a Black neighborhood butted up against a cluster of KKK memberships or a Catholic neighborhood. It would be interesting to try and imagine what was going on the streets among neighbors in zones like that across Colorado. So there is a lot that we can do with this. It will be slow, expensive, time-consuming, but well worth the investment of effort.
Yeah, kind of along those lines, what Jared said, I'm very curious about how a map of KKK membership would compare to the redlining maps that we have of the 1930s, and to see where were Klan members, were they part of, what neighborhoods were they part of, and how were they affected by redlining? policies of the 1930s to the 60s. So that would be my dream question.
And doing stuff like that, Nikki, I think would allow us to do two things. First of all, it might reveal some surprising things. We might discover that things that we have suspected but not been able to demonstrate empirically are not in fact the case. On the other hand, they also might, and this is even more powerful, be able to confirm stuff for us, again, that we have suspected, but haven't actually been able to confirm empirically so far. So I just think that there's a lot that we can improve on our existing knowledge and also learn perhaps some surprising things.
The
Yeah, thank you
voting
both.
patterns would be interesting here too. Mayor Stapleton, for instance, who's been much in the news lately, and his name has been changed to Central Park neighborhood. And if you look more closely in his life and his election history, he joined the Klan for their political support. He later leaves the Klan and denounces them fairly eloquently, saying, "True Americans do not hide under a sheet."
Did he ever express regret for having joined the Klan, Tom?
I think he did, if I'm remembering this right, Dwayne. And certainly he denounces them lately.
How many,
The Klan's
how-
disruption was their leaders fought with the national leaders. John Gaylord Locke himself was ousted from the Klan. There was a great deal of internal dissent, which did the Klan in.
how many governors, if any, were members of the Klan?
Clarence Morley, the only member. He defeated William Sweet, a progressive who fought the Klan. And then, it was, as you know, Morley winds up in Leavenworth for mail fraud. At the end of his life, when he's 70 years old, he goes to jail.
People who are searching will be able to find both Benjamin Stapleton and Clarence Morley in these ledgers, along with a number of other prominent folks. One thing I'm especially curious about, Jared and Nikki, you mentioned mapping, and History Colorado is undertaking a mapping project, although we would welcome help. I think there are some very sophisticated cartographers out there who could help us with this. And we're all interested in those questions. One thing that I'm especially interested in is that for about 2/3 of these entries, workplaces were recorded. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what that says about interlocking systems of oppression. When we talk about systemic racism, how does that show up when you start to see places of business in these ledgers? I'd love for some of you to contemplate that for us.
Well, there's the KKK Cafe, the Cool Cozy Cafe, run by Gato Center, and a lot of businesses that use the KKK business in their names. Oh, and they also serve cigars there that said Sienna Cigars, Catholics, you are not Americans. But I suspect, Jason, that the businesses were a main way of recruiting Klansmen, then keeping you in the Klan, or you'd lose your job or your seniority or whatever.
And it was also a tool. I mean, the focus on businesses was also a tool that the Klan used to keep non-Klan member businesses down. And if you were, a minority person who owned a business, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, Jason, but that double oppression of being, a minority person in society anyway, and then having a boycott placed on your business because you're not eligible or you're not American enough, as determined by the Klan. So, I mean, I think the economic effects, and this gets to what Jared was saying and what we were saying earlier, the economic effects of the actions and the policies of the Klan in the 20s would reverberate for decades. I mean, that's to understand the inequities of today's society, we really have to go back to something like the 1920s Klan, where certain practices were put into place that would disadvantage certain populations for decades to come.
And I wonder about, again, we have to, do the digitizing and do the mapping, but I wonder if we might uncover certain industries that were particularly prone to Klan membership or Klan involvement. Somebody put in the chat, like, what if we, discovered particular government or law enforcement or something like that, areas of employment that were that come up especially frequently in these ledgers. That would have big implications to know if certain industries or economic sectors had tight Klan ties. That would be interesting to know.
Yeah, I think your mention, Jared, of the police, I mean, that's very relevant for today, the way those populations were treated by a police force that was connected to the Klan is significant.
Yeah, certainly government employees were under pressure when your mayor and your head of the police department, I think Nikki was saying, puts pressure on you not to hire Irish cops or Catholic cops and to get rid of the ones that are there.
I think it's worth calling out because I don't think that all of the audience here can see all of the commentary. So I apologize if this is redundant, but there have been a number of interesting points made in the chat about the implications of things like education, medicine, or real estate. Again, if we could demonstrate that there were particular ties in any of those fields, like law enforcement, that would really go a long way to help us understand the intersection of different oppressive systems, the way in which white supremacy is embedded systematically and structurally in systems that all citizens in the United States and all people who are non-citizens as well are participating in, whether it's the educational system or medicine or things like that. That are, ostensibly neutral, right? Medicine is scientific, but if we demonstrate tight connections to white supremacist organizations, then we can start to imagine the ways in which medicine may be rife with white supremacy.
Jason, one of the questions, comments that come up on the chat box is, what impact would knowing one of your relatives or family members was a member of the Klan from 1920 to 1924, is that going to have any impact on families that are related to them today?
Well, I was thinking about this and putting it in contemporary terms as well. We have already a very divisive society, where people, have taken a polarizing position. And that's from simply belonging to mainstream political groups rather than, groups that are widely condemned as morally reprehensible. So this is really quite problematic. If we take our current situation into consideration, I think we need to try very hard to understand, people who have taken these, well, for want of a better word, odious positions, or joined these odious organizations, because they could very well, as you just pointed out, be our relatives, right? Our relatives. And they may have, in fact, been involved for seemingly good reasons. Good reasons. I mean, the kind of reasons that Tom was enumerating. So I think one of the things that is incumbent upon us is try to understand, why they did what they did, to, in a sense, skip beyond simply the fact that they were a member. I think that applies then, as it does now. And I do it for the sake of, family harmony, for no other reason, given the fact that some members of the family may be on opposite sides. And the fact of the matter is, I love them too much to simply turn my back on them, Thanks.
I think it's also worth pointing out here. I think that question of, could this be used to harm people today by guilt by association through their ancestry? On one hand, I want to say that, I would never condone that use of historical sources. I think it's a logical fallacy to attack somebody for something that, somebody in their family generations behind in the past did. On the other hand, I think it's also worth pointing out that there's a certain amount of privilege that is expressed if I say something like it's, it'd be unfair for me, for example, to be criticized for who my ancestors are, because it's something that our Black and Latinx and Indigenous and Asian and other neighbors experience all the time. They're judged by who they are, who their family is, what the color of their skin is, and suffer tremendous disadvantage. And so, if it were to happen that somebody were disadvantaged because of ancestry or family members belonging to this organization, it wouldn't be the first time that somebody in Colorado was judged unfairly and disadvantaged by who they are and who their family ancestors are.
If a member of the panel can ask the other panel members a question, I'd like to do that. How do you folks feel that we feel today about immigration as opposed to how we felt about immigrants back in the 1920s, 100 years ago? Are the feelings still the same? Do we still regard them as maybe not real Americans? Aside from the numbers, obviously, there are a lot of people at the border, but I'd like to ask if the feelings towards immigration today are about the same that they were 100 years ago.
I fear they are, Dwayne. Consider our most recent president who ran on building a wall.
Mhm.
Here, I'm going to take an opportunity to plug the Colorado Magazine. This is History Colorado's publication, flagship publication, and our own Dr. Way, who has written part one of a history of immigration to Colorado, which we published a few months ago, and part two, bringing it up to the present, we are publishing in the month ahead. So, William, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, thank you for plugging the article and the magazine. And let me, first of all, agree, as I often do, with Tom, that I feel that the sentiments are quite the same, because of the underlying factors that have given rise to them. And that goes to the nativist streak that we have in American culture, which is founded on anti-foreignism, and immigrants are defined as foreign, in spite of the fact that we can all trace our families back to some immigrants, with the exception of course, the Native Americans and Blacks who were involuntarily brought to this country. But that kind of xenophobia that existed in the past continues right up to the present, and people have seized upon that with fair regularity. So this is a pattern that shows up, and I think it really does reflect how they feel about immigrants. They may try to explain it differently. They have gotten more sophisticated in how they justify their anti-immigrant attitudes, and much of it, as you know, is leveled against Latino or Latinx immigrants. But Yeah, it's the same one. You change the name of the people, same attitude, same opposition to them.
This is probably broadening it out a little bit, but in 1932, Herbert Eugene Bolton from California University gave a 12-page paper to the American Historical Association. It was called Epic of Greater America. And his point was that anybody who came to America to mix with the indigenous people who are already here had a common history. And it didn't make any difference if you were in Alaska or on the tip of the Straits of Magellan. Anybody who came to America had a common history. And we're all immigrants, except the people who were here when the Europeans got here. And I got a lot of that from my father and grandfather who migrated over from Belgium. We're fortunately, white. We had a problem, however, we were Catholic, so that didn't help. But I'd like to have everybody think of that common history. It doesn't make a damn bit of difference who you are. You came to America, you got a common history. We're all the same. And that's what made America and the United States great.
Fully agree with that. And I'd like to say, and I mean this sincerely, that sometimes I think immigrants are, if you will, more American than those who are born here, mainly because they embrace the ideals of the country. And by ideals and values of the country, I'm referring to things like, racial equality and social justice and political empowerment for all people. They embrace those ideals. They had to study about these ideals in order to become citizens, and they commit to them. I suspect a lot of people who are born here, do not know what the ideals of the country are, and just, promoting, if you will, their own power and privilege to which they were born.
Well, Bill,
William, could I add that we are all
Tom, if I
related
may,
through Adam and Eve?
Tom, I'd like to explore another similarity, a question that we received as we draw these comparisons and contrasts between the 1920s, the period that the ledgers focus on, and maybe more contemporary times. The question is about the economics and whether there are similarities in the economic conditions of the 1920s that played into nativist sentiment then that we might see playing into some nativist sentiment now.
Well, the logical answer to that, Jason, is, and we still hear it today, is that if you talk about immigrants take American jobs. And that's the economic.
I mean, that's the nativist argument, Dwayne.
That's right. Exactly. No, I don't agree with that. I'm just saying that you want some economics. That's it. But I don't see too many so-called Americans picking lettuce and strawberries out in California, cleaning up motel rooms, as a lot of the immigrant people do today. But I mean, that's the economic argument that you're talking about.
So,
Oh,
Go ahead.
okay. Also, I think, following World War I, there was American farmers really never recovered. And so you have a large swath of the population who are experiencing economic hardship throughout the 1920s, and they wouldn't recover and, through the Great Depression. So I think, we might, and I need to, think about this a little bit more, but I think there are important parallels where people are struggling, and maybe it's in the same kind of rural settings where that, in both eras where, where the Klan and white supremacist groups, white nationalist groups are very appealing because you're looking for a scapegoat. You're looking for someone to blame for your plight. So just add that.
Yeah, Yeah, that's a very good point. And what happens is that when people are aggrieved or angry, as you just point out, they look for scapegoats. And the people they will pick on are those that they consider to be the most vulnerable in the country. They take
And
it out.
this is a pattern we see, William, historically. You're talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
So to build a little bit on what Nikki said, Colorado was a state that was particularly not economically successful in the 1920s. We've all heard about the roaring 20s and the boom of the stock market and things like that, but agriculture and mining struggled mightily. And so Colorado, for many people in Colorado, the 20s and the 30s were just a continuous period of economic difficulty. The other thing I think that's worth pointing out is that the three manifestations of the Klan, right after the Civil War, right after World War I, and after World War II and during the Cold War, were all periods when white American identity was being challenged by various forces that were fallouts from the wars. And I think it's probably not an accident that nativist and white supremacist sentiment, well, it's no question that nativist and white white supremacist sentiment surged during those years. And I think given that, it's no surprise that those are periods when the Klan really emerges. If we go back to my model of it as an episodic phenomenon rather than a stable over time organization, these post-war periods really call into question white nationalist identity, and as a result make a larger percentage of the population than perhaps might be it might make more people receptive to Klan arguments. I think as it approaches 8:30, my brain is no longer quite as sharp as it was when I was teaching my classes this morning. Thank you, Nikki.
I think those are great points, Jared. And as you point out, we are driving toward 8:30, which is the conclusion of this program. So I'd like to end with a question that we've seen in various forms throughout the night from people watching. And that is, how can releasing these ledgers in a digital format and giving people new tools to analyze them with lead us to a better place in contemporary Colorado, or maybe put more simply by a high school teacher early on in the evening, what would we want our students to know from these ledgers about the Klan in the 20s and beyond? And I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on that.
I think the big lesson here would be that Colorado had the second highest per capita Klan membership, that it did happen here and it could happen here again. And by releasing these membership lists, we're educating people of that possibility.
And I would say that I think the great thing about this is that, and this is our dream as historians, people are talking about history. So I would want high school students to know that you can understand your present if you just understand a little bit more about the past. And just the fact that we have over 200 people on I don't even know what day it is, but Thursday, I think, today's Wednesday, on a Wednesday night talking about history. I mean, that's what this is all about, right? So that's from me. That's what I want.
To be a tad academic, I think this would provide our students and everyone else an opportunity to use what we consider a primary resource, to try to reconstruct an understanding of this important period in Colorado history.
I think Tom expressed my views the same way. I think, Sinclair Lewis wrote in the 1930s, it can happen here. And what happened in the 1920s certainly is not only indicative of the 20s. It can happen here, and in many ways, it has happened here.
I would echo that. Think about, I mean, there are thousands of these entries, and think about the very ordinariness of them. George C. Shaw, Roy Beale, Harry Klinger, Harry Hankey, Clyde Alford, Harold Husted, Alexander Rogers. I would like these documents to disabuse us of the notion that Klan and other white supremacist activity is perpetrated by a small number of evil people, but rather this is something that all of us are subjected to, prone to, in the right historical moment. Anybody can really become a part of this, and that we need to guard against that.
That's right. Very good. I fully agree with that. Yeah. Only way to protect yourself, from future mishaps is to understand them, in the past.
Well, thank you all. I would like to close by answering some of the questions that came in sort of en masse about the ledgers. These are, in fact, the only ledgers that we are aware of this sort that have been released in this way anywhere in the country, although we know that there are other records of the Klu Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations out there. We suspect that there are more than we know in county historical societies, libraries, family possession. We don't know where they are, but we hope that by taking this step as History Colorado, we can encourage others to take a similar step, because we believe that we will never learn from the past, especially a past that is kept intentionally in the dark, unless we bring it into the light and confront it. It is, I think, what is required of us always, and especially at the moment. And we hope that this does play a positive role in shaping a better Colorado going forward and helping us determine a path toward a better Colorado. I want to thank each and every one of you counselors for this. I know this is a lot of talking on a Wednesday night after many of you have been teaching classes all day, but clearly we had a lot of people who were very interested in this, remain interested in this. For those of you in the audience, I encourage you to visit our webpage. There you will find not only the ledgers, but more resources, and we'll be adding to those all the time. We have additional programs coming up. Bob Goldberg, Professor Robert Goldberg, who wrote Hooded Empire, Tom mentioned earlier, it's the seminal study of the Klan in Colorado, is giving a talk in June, and I hope you all come back for that. We also have Dwayne here. Dwayne Vandenbush is giving the state historian's address on May 16th at History Colorado Center and also online. Please consider joining us for that. And finally, please consider, I know many of you shared your stories and your thoughts in the chat. We have an invitation for you to do that in a way that will get to our curators and the people who manage our collections through our website. I would encourage any of you, if you have stories to share, no matter how this history is impacting your life, we would like to hear it at History Colorado. With that, thank you all so much for being here, and thanks especially to our counselors. I wish you all a wonderful night, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, folks.